Meanwhile, members of Congress are returning to Capitol Hill today to discuss Venezuela.
Lawmakers are expecting to learn more about what took place over the weekend and what comes next. Well, GMA's Marshall Farmer joins us this morning to explain what lawmakers are hoping to learn. Marshall?
Yeah, Deanna, Trent, lawmakers are returning to D.C. Sometime this week following a long holiday break, and now we'll learn what comes next. In an interview with us over the weekend, Congressman Nathaniel Moran says this week should provide answers and give Congress a chance to ask some questions.
I expect that we're going to get a good debrief when we return to Washington, D.C. on Monday or Tuesday and understand what the president wants to do moving forward. And I think Congress has a significant role to play constitutionally. Article 1 provides that Congress needs to be involved in these decisions if the use of military force is going to persist. I have lots of questions about what President Trump meant about us running Venezuela.
Members of Congress are sharing concerns about what the end goal for Venezuela is. According to Congressman Ro Khanna, that end game has not been made clear.
What we want to know is, what is the plan? They should come to Congress. They should be very clear that any further military intervention, they will seek congressional authorization, and they should answer how long we plan to stay there, how much this is going to cost the American taxpayers, and what the end game is.
While acting Venezuela President Delcy Rodriguez posted on social media overnight that she wants to focus on, quote, balanced and respectful international relations between the United States and Venezuela. In that same post, she called for peace and dialogue between the two countries, inviting the U.S. government to create a shared developmental agenda. And we hope to hear more from Congress in the coming days if further military action is expected. Deanna, Trent.
All right, Marshall, thank you.